The wind howled across the jagged cliffs, carrying with it the salty temps of the sea and the faint cry of gulls circling overhead. The sky was a brooding canvas of gray, streaked with darker clouds that promised rain. Below, the waves crashed against the rocks with a rhythmic fury, sending plumes of white spray into the air. It was a landscape both beautiful and forbidding, a place where the elements ruled supreme and human presence felt like an afterthought. And yet, there it stood, a solitary lighthouse. Its whitewashed walls, weathered by decades of wind and rain, its beacon slicing through the gloom with a steady, reassuring light. This was the Farhaven Lighthouse, perched on the edge of the world, a sentinel against the tempestuous sea. For over a century, it had guided ships safely through the treacherous waters, its light a lifeline for sailors navigating the narrow channel between the rocky shore and the open ocean. But times had changed. Modern navigation systems had rendered the lighthouse obsolete, and its once vital role had faded into history. Now, it was a relic, a symbol of a bygone era, and yet, it still had a keeper. His name was Thomas Grayson, a man in his late 60s with a face etched by the elements and a demeanor as steady as the lighthouse Thomas had been the keeper of Farhaven for over 30 years, a role he had inherited from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. The Graysons were a lighthouse family, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of the sea and the demands of the light. But Thomas was the last of his line. When he retired, the lighthouse would be automated, its care entrusted to machines. For now, though, it was still his domain, and he took his duties seriously. On this particular afternoon, Thomas stood on the narrow walkway that encircled the lantern room, his hands resting on the iron railing as he gazed out at the horizon. The wind tugged at his coat and whipped his gray hair into a frenzy, but he seemed oblivious to the cold. His eyes were fixed on the sea, scanning the waves for any sign of trouble. It was a habit born of decades of vigilance, a reflex as natural as breathing. Even now, with the lighthouse's role diminished, Thomas could not shake the sense of responsibility that came with the job. He was the last line of defense, the final guardian of the light. Below him, the lighthouse stood like a sentinel, its tower rising from a cluster of low buildings that housed the living quarters, storage rooms, and workshop. The buildings were sturdy and functional, built to withstand the harsh conditions of the coast, but they bore the marks of time. The paint was peeling, the wood was warped, and the roof sagged in places. Inside, the rooms were sparsely furnished, their walls lined with shelves filled with tools, spare parts, and old logbooks. It was a place frozen in time, a relic of an era when lighthouses were manned by men like Thomas, men who lived and breathed the sea. As the afternoon wore on, the sky grew darker, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the first drops of rain. Thomas descended the spiral staircase that wound its way down the tower, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space. He moved with the ease of someone who had made the journey countless times, his hands brushing against the rough stone walls as he went. When he reached the bottom, he stepped into the living quarters, a small room dominated by a wooden table, a pair of chairs, and a cast iron stove. The room was warm and cozy, a stark contrast to the storm brewing outside. Thomas sat at the table and opened one of the logbooks, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. Each entry recorded the weather conditions, the state of the light, and any notable events: a ship passing by, a storm, a repair made to the machinery. It was a chronicle of life at the lighthouse, a testament to the daily rhythms of a keeper's existence. Thomas flipped through the pages, his eyes lingering on entries from years past. There were notes from his father and grandfather, their handwriting, familiar and comforting. He traced a finger over the faded ink, feeling a connection to the men who had come before him, men who had stood watch over the light just as he did. Now, as the storm outside intensified, Thomas closed the logbook and stood up. He crossed the room to the window and peered out at the sea, now a churning mass of gray and white. The waves were higher, their crests breaking against the rocks with a thunderous roar. The rain lashed against the glass, blurring the view, but Thomas could still make out the faint outline of a ship on the horizon. It was a small vessel, its sails barely visible through the storm. Thomas frowned, his instincts kicking in. The ship was too close to the shore, its course dangerously near the rocks. He watched for a moment, his heart pounding, before turning away from the window and heading for the door. Outside, the wind was fierce, tearing at his clothes and stinging his face with rain. Thomas made his way to the boathouse, a small structure tucked into the lie of the lighthouse. Inside, a rowboat rested on a wooden cradle, its hull weathered but sturdy. Thomas grabbed a life jacket and a coil of rope, then pushed the boat down the ramp and into the water. The waves were rough, the boat rocking violently as he climbed aboard and took up the oars. He rowed with practiced ease, his muscles straining against the current as he made his way toward the ship. The storm raged around him, the wind howling and the rain driving into his face. The ship loomed ahead, its hull battered by the waves. Thomas could see figures on the deck, their movements frantic as they struggled to keep the vessel afloat. He called out, his voice barely audible over the storm, and one of the figures turned toward him, relief evident even at a distance. Thomas maneuvered the rowboat alongside the ship, tossing the rope to the crew. One by one, they climbed down, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion. Thomas helped them into the boat, his hands steady despite the chaos around them. By the time they reached the shore, the storm had begun to abate, the rain easing and the wind dying down. Thomas guided the rowboat onto the beach, the crew stumbling onto the sand, their legs unsteady after the ordeal. He led them to the lighthouse, where they huddled around the stove, their clothes steaming as they dried. Thomas handed out blankets and mugs of hot tea, his movements calm and methodical. The crew thanked him, their voices filled with gratitude, but Thomas simply nodded, his mind already turning to the next task. As the crew rested, Thomas returned to the lantern room, climbing the stairs with a sense of purpose. The light still burned, its beam cutting through the darkness, a beacon of hope in the storm. Thomas checked the machinery, his hands moving with the precision of someone who knew every cog and gear. Satisfied that everything was in order, he stood at the railing once more, his eyes scanning the horizon. The storm had passed, the sea now calm and dark, its surface reflecting the light of the moon. Thomas took a deep breath, the salty air filling his lungs, and felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was his life, his calling. The lighthouse was more than just a job. It was a part of him, a legacy passed down through generations. And though he knew his time as keeper was drawing to a close, he also knew that the light would endure, a symbol of hope and safety for those who braved the sea. For now, though, it was still his to tend, his to protect. And so, Thomas Grayson, the last lighthouse keeper, stood watch over the light, a solitary figure in a world of wind and waves.